The sun had barely risen over the jagged mountains of a foreign territory when the 540 Marines of Echo Battalion realized they had been plunged into a nightmare that no one back home would know about, at least not yet. The operation had started as routine, or at least as routine as any deployment into hostile territory could ever be. The mission briefings were concise, peppered with the kind of vague intelligence that would later seem suspicious in hindsight. A series of checkpoints to secure, enemy movements to observe, and coordination with local allies who promised support if needed. But what the Marines didn't know, and what their commanders hadn't fully disclosed, was that the intelligence they had trusted, the maps they had memorized, and the GPS coordinates they relied on were outdated, incomplete, and dangerously misleading. The battalion had walked straight into the teeth of an enemy force more organized and prepared than anyone had anticipated. Within hours, what should have been a simple maneuver to establish a forward operating position became a desperate fight for survival. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, the young officer leading Echo's advance squad, felt the shift immediately. The first signs were subtle. The silence of the enemy at dawn, too calculated, too quiet. The absence of expected reconnaissance signals. A sudden lack of radio traffic from adjacent units. Then came the first shots, sharp, deliberate, and coming from multiple directions simultaneously. A coordinated ambush. Marines fell where they stood, some clutching wounds that seemed impossible to survive, others racing for cover behind rocks and overturned vehicles, their faces painted with a mix of shock and instinctual terror. Private First Class Daniel Ortega, a 6'2" Marine from Arizona, ducked behind a jagged boulder, ears ringing from a grenade explosion nearby. His squad mates were pinned down, returning fire as best they could, but every round seemed to make no difference. The enemy had them at a crossfire, and the geography itself was unforgiving. Steep ridges on either side, no cover in sight, and supply lines stretched to breaking point. Daniel's stomach churned with the realization that the outside world had no idea where they were, and in all probability, it didn't even care. As the battalion's command post tried to respond, the radios went dead. Attempts to call for air support were met with static, then silence. Helicopters that were supposed to fly overhead were nowhere in sight. Hayes' eyes darted across the rocky ridges, searching for any sign of reinforcements. But the mountains were empty, save for the shadowy figures of enemy snipers who seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. The Marines were trapped. By midday, Echo Battalion had established a makeshift defensive perimeter. They had casualties more than anyone could count in the chaos, but they refused to surrender. Corporal Lila Simmons, one of the few female squad leaders, moved from position to position, directing fire, patching wounds, and rallying the troops with a calm intensity that belied the fear creeping into her chest. She was the kind of Marine who commanded respect, not by rank alone, but by sheer force of will. Every time a Marine faltered or froze, she would grab their arm, look them square in the eyes, and issue a single command: "We survive." That's all that matters right now. Even as they fought, the reality of abandonment began to sink in. Messages to higher command were ignored or delayed. Air support was rerouted for missions deemed more critical. The battalion was officially listed as MIA in bureaucratic reports that would eventually reach the Pentagon. On the ground, this meant that 540 Marines were effectively fighting alone, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and the possibility of a timely extraction. Food was running low, water scarcer. Medical supplies had been depleted in the first wave of injuries, and soldiers improvised bandages from torn uniforms and rags. Morale, though strained, refused to collapse entirely. Even in the darkest moments, whispered jokes, quiet songs, and small acts of defiance kept the battalion alive, not just physically, but mentally. Each Marine knew that survival depended on maintaining composure, on trusting one another, and on the faint hope that someone, somewhere, might defy orders and come for them. The first night was the hardest. The enemy did not rest, using the cover of darkness to infiltrate positions and probe defenses. Echo Battalion responded with disciplined volleys, every shot measured, every movement deliberate. Sleep was a distant memory. Fires from the first day's skirmishes had burned the landscape, creating a hellish scene of smoke and shadows that twisted in the moonlight. Marines huddled together for warmth, sharing rations and words of encouragement, knowing that if fear took over, they might not survive until dawn. By the third day, the battalion's strength had been visibly reduced. Marksmen like Sergeant Jackson worked tirelessly to provide covering fire, picking off enemy snipers with precision that defied exhaustion. The wounded were stabilized as best they could, some carried on stretchers over rocky terrain, others dragged along by their comrades, who refused to leave anyone behind. Every Marine became a lifeline for another, forming bonds that were forged not in training or camaraderie, but in the crucible of near death. Amid the chaos, whispers began circulating about Higher Command's decision. It wasn't that they had forgotten Echo Battalion, it was that they had chosen to prioritize other operations over these 540 men and women. The Marines felt a bitter sting of betrayal, yet it fueled a quiet rage that sharpened their focus. They were no longer fighting merely to survive. They were fighting to prove that they could not be discarded. Every action, every maneuver, became a declaration. We are not dead yet. And then, on the fourth day, as exhaustion and hunger reached a breaking point, something unexpected happened. A distant hum, barely audible over the gunfire, echoed through the valley. Heads turned skyward. A silhouette appeared, cutting across the gray clouds a helicopter, low, moving fast, and remarkably precise. For a moment, disbelief froze the Marines. Could it be? Was someone really coming to save them? Or was it another trick, another wave of enemy deception? Captain Rachel Donovan was on that helicopter, far from the bureaucratic safety of the command center, having made a decision that would forever change the lives of these Marines. She had intercepted fragmented transmissions of their plight, and despite explicit orders to the contrary, resolved to act. She had read the reports, studied the maps, and calculated every risk. Rules and regulations be damned, 540 Marines were in mortal danger, and she would not let them die. Below her, Echo Battalion watched as the helicopter drew closer. A spark of hope ignited in their hearts, a feeling they hadn't dared to indulge in days. For the first time, the thought of survival seemed real rather than a desperate fantasy. As the rotors kicked up dust and debris, the Marines braced themselves for what would either be salvation or another test of endurance against an uncaring world. The mission had begun as a standard operation, but it had become a crucible of courage, endurance, and defiance. And now, with the faint but unmistakable sign of a rescue overhead, the narrative was about to change. The Marines would soon discover that even in the face of bureaucratic neglect and overwhelming odds, the courage of one person could alter the course of history. But none of them knew how harrowing the next hours would be, how close they would come to death, or how extraordinary the courage of the woman in that helicopter would have to be to save 540 lives against impossible odds. The mission no one spoke about had just entered a new, unimaginable Chapter 1 that would test every limit of human endurance, skill, and determination. While Echo Battalion fought for every inch of ground, back at the command center thousands of miles away, a very different kind of battle was taking place, a battle of bureaucracy, protocol, and political calculation. The intelligence reports had reached the desks of generals and aides, each one carefully analyzed, debated, and ultimately dismissed as a low-priority incident. The term, MIA, had already been stamped onto their status reports, effectively writing off 540 Marines as lost in the field. Colonel Henry Whitaker, a veteran officer with decades of service, sat behind a polished mahogany desk, his hands folded over the reports, as if sheer will could alter reality. He was a man caught between moral responsibility and military pragmatism. "We can't afford to risk another unit," he said, repeating a phrase that had been drilled into him since his earliest days of service. "The intelligence indicates that this is an isolated loss. A rescue would cost too many lives, and operational priorities take precedence." In the same room, aides scrolled through satellite imagery, counting dots on a map and debating probabilities like numbers in a ledger. They had no way of feeling the fear, the grit, the blood and mud of soldiers clinging to life. They saw the battalion as abstract units, statistics to be managed. Risk assessments replaced empathy, timelines replaced urgency, and the human element, the men and women under fire, was dismissed as collateral. Meanwhile, inside Echo Battalion's makeshift perimeter, the Marines had begun to understand the bitter truth. Help wasn't coming. The radios that had once symbolized connection now seemed like instruments of betrayal. Each call for air support that went unanswered was a punch to morale, a reminder that the rules of engagement in the field were dictated not by courage or need, but by distant decisions made in sterile offices. The realization was heavy, almost tangible, settling into their chests like a lead weight. Corporal Lila Simmons paced the perimeter, her eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow, every movement in the distance. She had begun to notice patterns in the enemy's attack snipers' rotating positions, squads attempting to flank, artillery strikes landing with alarming precision. But there was another pattern she couldn't ignore, the silence from their own command. "They've left us," muttered one young Marine under his breath, barely audible over the occasional gunfire. Lele froze for a heartbeat, recognizing the truth in those words. She nodded, silently acknowledging the harsh reality. "Not yet," she whispered, almost as if by saying it aloud, she could make it untrue. "We're still alive. That counts for something." Food and water were nearly gone by the second day. Medics were exhausted, forced to treat severe wounds with makeshift bandages and morphine rations that were dwindling. Every night, soldiers huddled together, sharing the last bits of energy they could muster. Conversations turned to home, a mother's lullaby, a sibling's laughter, the aroma of morning coffee, anything that reminded them of life beyond the mountains. Yet even in these quiet moments, fear lingered, gnawing at their resolve. Each man and woman knew the odds, and yet none admitted defeat. Meanwhile, at the distant airbase, Captain Rachel Donovan reviewed the intercepted communications once more. She replayed the radio chatter, piecing together fragmented calls, hearing the desperation the command chose to ignore. Every line told the same story. 540 Marines trapped and surrounded, with no help in sight. She slammed her fist onto the table. Orders or not, rules or not, she could not allow them to die. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination, each beat echoing the urgency of the situation. Rachel's superiors had warned her repeatedly. The mission she was considering was unauthorized. Breaking protocol meant risking her career, her rank, and her reputation. Court-martial was inevitable if she was caught. Yet as she stared at the radar blips and traced potential flight paths, she realized something undeniable. The Marines' lives were in her hands, and inaction was tantamount to complicity. Her decision crystallized. She would fly. Every regulation, every rulebook, and every bureaucratic mandate would bend to a single overriding principle: survival. Back in the mountains, Hayes and Simmons coordinated defensive positions. Ammunition was rationed with precision, every bullet accounted for. Soldiers took turns rotating through positions to maintain vigilance despite exhaustion, knowing that the slightest lapse could result in catastrophic losses. Despite the despair, camaraderie remained their strongest weapon. Marines shared whispered jokes, sang softly, and told stories of past victories to keep fear at bay. Laughter, fragile and fleeting, became a rebellion against the reality surrounding them. It was a small reminder that they were still human, still alive, and still capable of fighting. The enemy intensified their assault on the third night. Rockets and mortar struck closer than before, forcing the battalion to huddle in craters, using the jagged rocks as shields. Hayes watched soldiers he had trained, mentored, and fought alongside struggle to stay upright under the barrage. Some were injured, some were terrified, but all were determined. Every Marine had made a silent pact. They would survive if only for each other. Their unity had become a lifeline, a tether to life itself. Even as the battle raged, the thought of command's indifference gnawed at them. Whispered conversations revealed the truth. No reinforcements, no resupply, no official extraction. The phrase, "we've been abandoned," was muttered again and again, an acknowledgement of bureaucratic coldness that made survival even more urgent. Some Marines allowed themselves moments of quiet rage, imagining the people in command centers, counting dots on maps, while their comrades bled in the dirt. Yet this anger transformed into a new kind of resolve. They would survive, even without support. They would not become statistic. It was then, in the still moments before dawn on the fourth day, that a distant hum reached their ears. Marines froze, scanning the ridges, alert to any sign of enemy ambush. The sound grew louder, the beat of rotors cutting through the silence, a strange mixture of hope and disbelief filling the air. Could it be real? Could someone actually be coming for them? The soldiers exchanged glances, eyes wide, hearts hammering with a renewed sense of possibility. Rachel's helicopter approached with surgical precision, flying low to avoid detection by enemy positions. Each second of flight carried unimaginable risk. One miscalculation and the mission would fail, leaving the battalion to die. She checked instruments, communicated silently with her crew, and mentally rehearsed each landing, each extraction, each emergency maneuver. Every calculation, every heartbeat, carried the lives of 540 Marines. She was aware that she might not return, but in that moment, all that mattered was them. A distant hum transformed into the roar of hope as dust and debris were kicked up by the rotor blades. Marines who had nearly given up glanced skyward, disbelief fighting with hope, fear mixing with exhilaration. The impossible was happening. Someone had come for them. Even those who had prepared themselves for death felt their spirits lift. The battalion, abandoned and outnumbered, had finally been seen. Yet the mission was far from over. The silence from command was a constant shadow over every action, reminding the Marines that no rules guaranteed their survival. Even as the helicopter approached, danger was all around, enemy positions still active, terrain treacherous, and exhaustion threatening every decision. Still, the psychological impact of seeing a rescue attempt changed everything. It renewed morale, sparked courage, and reminded them why they fought: to live, to survive, and to honor each other. By the time Rachel's helicopter was within range, the Marines were ready. Despite injuries, fear, and fatigue, they prepared for extraction. Every movement was deliberate, every eye vigilant. They understood that one mistake could be fatal, that their survival depended not just on courage, but on discipline, coordination, and trust in a single pilot who had defied orders to reach them. In that moment, the battalion transformed from a group abandoned to a force united, waiting for a chance to be lifted from the jaws of death. The silence from command had been deafening, but it had not broken them. The Marines of Echo Battalion had survived against the odds, fueled by skill, courage, and unyielding determination. Now, with the rotors slicing through the sky, they dared to hope. And somewhere high above, a pilot was about to prove that one person's courage could defy bureaucracy, rewrite fate, and turned despair into salvation. Captain Rachel Donovan had never been one to follow rules blindly. From the moment she'd earned her wings, she had been known for her precision, courage, and uncanny ability to stay calm under fire. Her peers often whispered that she seemed to anticipate danger before it even arrived. But even Rachel had never faced a situation quite like this. Sitting in the dimly lit communications room at the airbase, she replayed intercepted transmissions again and again, trying to piece together the reality of what was happening hundreds of miles away in hostile territory. Fragmented radio calls, bursts of static, and desperate voices painted a terrifying picture. Echo Battalion, 540 Marines, trapped, outnumbered, abandoned. Some calls were frantic, others eerily calm soldiers, trained to maintain composure under pressure. Each word carried urgency, each pause a chilling reminder of lives on the line. Rachel leaned closer to the receiver, feeling her chest tighten as the human reality behind the statistics became undeniable. These weren't numbers on a map. These were fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, friends. They were Americans fighting for survival, and no one was coming to help. Her instincts screamed that every second mattered. Orders and protocol weighed heavily in her mind, but they suddenly seemed irrelevant. Standard procedure demanded she wait for approval, coordinate with command, and ensure all risks were minimized. But every delay meant lives lost. The voices of the trapped Marines, their fear, their courage, their unwavering determination, overrode every instruction she had ever received. Her fingers hovered over the control panel. One decision could mean the difference between life and death. Rachel had spent years training for high-stakes missions, learning how to make split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance. She knew the risk of defying orders, career-ending consequences, potential court-martial, even dishonorable discharge. But she also knew something else. Doing nothing would be unforgivable. Her heart hammered as she realized the stakes. This wasn't just a mission. It was a test of conscience, courage, and everything she had learned about leadership under fire. She called her crew into the planning room, a tight-knit team who had flown with her for years. Their faces mirrored her tension, eyes sharp, expressions serious, knowing that what Rachel proposed could alter every one of their lives forever. She laid out the situation with brutal honesty. "They've been abandoned," she said, voice steady but urgent. 540 Marines. Cut off, no support, no extraction. Standard protocol says we stay grounded, but I'm not letting them die. We fly. The room was silent. The weight of her words hung in the air like the prelude to a storm. Lieutenant Jackson, her second in command, broke the silence. "Captain, if we do this, we're risking everything. Not just our careers, but our lives." Rachel met his gaze, unflinching. "I know," she said. "And if we stay here and do nothing, they all die. Every single one of them. We're the only chance they have. Are we going to be cowards, or are we going to fly?" Her crew, inspired by her conviction, nodded. Each of them understood the risk, yet none hesitated. They had trained together, trusted each other in combat, and believed in Rachel's judgment implicitly. The decision was made. The mission would be executed, unauthorized though it was. The plan began to take shape in Rachel's mind, intricate and daring, accounting for terrain, enemy positions, fuel limits, and extraction logistics. She visualized each maneuver, each landing, each ascent under fire. Rachel moved to the flight simulator to rehearse the mission, mapping every ridge, valley, and potential threat. She calculated wind speed, rotor clearance, and the timing of enemy patrol rotations. She knew that any misstep could result in catastrophic failure, but she also knew that hesitation was not an option. Her eyes were sharp, her mind focused, every detail committed to memory. Outside, the night was quiet, deceptive, hiding the chaos of the battlefield below. As the helicopter sat ready on the tarmac, engines humming softly, Rachel felt the gravity of the moment settle in her chest. This mission would be the defining moment of her career, not in accolades or medals, but in human lives. She reviewed her checklists, confirmed fuel, ammunition, and emergency protocols. Her crew moved with quiet precision, understanding that time was critical and mistakes were not tolerated. They were ready, committed, and prepared to defy convention for the greater good. Rachel paused for a moment, her gaze shifting to the radar screens that showed a scattering of enemy positions. She imagined the Marines below, trapped in mud, bloodied, exhausted, their hope dwindling. The image tightened her chest and steeled her nerves. One voice caught her attention, a young Marine calling out over the radio, desperation in his tone. She could almost hear his heartbeat, feel his fear. That single voice, multiplied by hundreds, solidified her resolve. They were counting on her. They had no other choice. Minutes later, the helicopter lifted off the ground, engines roaring, lights cutting through the darkness. Rachel guided it low and fast, avoiding radar and known enemy positions. Every twist and turn of the mountains tested her skills to the limit. Her crew communicated in terse, precise phrases, each one focused, each action rehearsed. The weight of the mission pressed on them, but the training, trust, and shared resolve carried them forward. As the helicopter approached the first ridge overlooking the battalion's position, Rachel could make out flashes of gunfire and shadows moving in the dust below. The Marines, weary and almost defeated, looked up at the rotor blades slicing through the night sky. A flicker of disbelief crossed their faces. Could this really be happening? After days of abandonment, after being deemed expendable, a chance at survival had arrived. Rachel's voice cut through the comms, calm but authoritative. "Hold tight," she said. "We're coming for you." On the ground, Hayes relayed her instructions to the battalion, coordinating movements, preparing wounded and able-bodied Marines alike for the impossible task of evacuation. Every detail mattered: timing, positioning, weight distribution, and cover fire. Each Marine understood the stakes. They had been trained for this, yet nothing could have prepared them for the reality of being rescued under fire. Enemy positions began to react to the presence of the helicopter. Tracer rounds arced through the night, forcing Rachel to execute precise, evasive maneuvers. Every second was a gamble. One miscalculation and the battalion would be exposed, or worse, the helicopter could be downed. Rachel's hands gripped the controls, muscles tense, eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow, every glint of metal that could signal danger. Her crew responded seamlessly, coordinating the defensive measures necessary to protect both aircraft and personnel. Even as danger mounted, Rachel's focus never wavered. She had committed herself fully to this mission, knowing that hesitation was lethal. The weight of responsibility was enormous, yet it sharpened her instincts, heightened her awareness, and drove her forward. The trapped Marines were counting on her, and she would not fail them. Every action, every decision, every risk was calculated to maximize survival against overwhelming odds. Below, Echo Battalion prepared for the impossible. They had trained for combat, for endurance, for adversity, but nothing could have readied them for being rescued in the midst of active engagement against impossible odds. Yet seeing the helicopter hover in the distance, some soldiers felt a surge of hope that had almost been extinguished by exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Lila Simmons barked orders, rallying her troops, ensuring that each movement was coordinated for maximum efficiency. Lives depended on every second, every step, every decision. Rachel adjusted altitude and trajectory, lining up the approach to the extraction point. The valley below was chaotic, filled with smoke, debris, and the wounded scrambling for cover. Her heart raced, but her voice remained calm, guiding her crew through the perilous approach. Every Marine on the ground was aware of their role, moving with precision despite fatigue and fear. The impossible was about to become reality, and Rachel Donovan was the fulcrum upon which it balanced. The first moments of contact were tense, silent, but for the whine of rotors and the distant cracks of gunfire. Marines clung to hope as Rachel's helicopter descended, ready to begin the extraction that could save or doom them. Every detail mattered. Every breath was measured. The mission that had begun with despair was now entering the most critical, dangerous, and extraordinary phase, the actual rescue. And all eyes, both in the sky and on the ground, were fixed on one unwavering fact: courage could defy protocol, and heroism could arrive when all hope seemed lost. The air smelled of fuel, ozone, and tension as Captain Rachel Donovan climbed into the cockpit, the whine of the helicopter engines reverberating through the metal frame. Outside, her crew secured their harnesses, faces tight with focus. Every movement was deliberate, every glance a silent acknowledgement of the stakes. Rachel's hands hovered over the controls, feeling the weight of the mission settle onto her shoulders. This was no ordinary flight. This was a mission that defied every regulation, every protocol, every expectation. And if she failed, hundreds of lives would vanish before dawn. "Let's do this," Rachel whispered to herself, more a vow than a command. The airbase lay in the darkness behind them, safe and detached. Ahead stretched hostile terrain, enemy patrols, and countless unknown dangers. Yet there was no room for hesitation. Every minute wasted meant more Marines falling, more lives lost. She knew that inaction was tantamount to complicity. The battalion below, 540 Marines, was counting on her courage and skill. She could not, would not, disappoint them. The helicopter lifted off with a soft shudder, the rotors slicing through the night air. Rachel maintained a low altitude to avoid enemy radar, hugging valleys and skirting mountain ridges. Each maneuver required split-second decisions. One wrong angle, one miscalculation, could spell disaster. Behind her, her crew monitored the communications channels, ready to relay instructions, suppress fire, or respond to emergencies. Their trust in Rachel was absolute. Years of flying together had forged an unspoken bond that would now be tested in the crucible of combat. Lieutenant Jackson, monitoring the radar and maps, pointed out potential danger zones. "Flak positions, 2 clicks ahead," he warned. Rachel adjusted her trajectory smoothly, keeping the helicopter as low as possible while avoiding treacherous ridges. The valley narrowed, jagged rocks looming on either side, the wind howling through gaps in the terrain. It was a dangerous dance of physics, human skill, and sheer nerve. The crew knew that every decision would ripple downward, affecting the lives of every Marine below. The first flashes of gunfire lit up the mountainside. Enemy snipers had spotted them. Rachel's heart raced, but her hands were steady. "Hold tight," she called to her crew. Machine guns on the helicopter opened fire to suppress enemy positions. Below, the Marines instinctively ducked, hoping the aircraft could withstand the hail of bullets. Dust and debris churned in the air, and the roar of engines mixed with the crack of gunfire. Every second felt like an eternity, every movement a gamble against death. Rachel's mind remained focused, calculating landing zones, potential extraction sequences, and timing with clockwork precision. She had only one chance to get close enough to the Marines without being shot down, and she would not squander it. She recalled her training for emergency landings, evasive maneuvers, and rapid loadings. Each skill honed in peacetime exercises was now a matter of survival. This was no drill. This was reality, raw and unforgiving. "Prepare for landing," Rachel ordered, her voice calm despite the chaos. The first wave of Marines scrambled toward the designated pickup area, guided by the rotor's shadow and the roaring engines overhead. Corporal Lila Simmons coordinated movements, her voice sharp, directing wounded and able-bodied alike. Soldiers who had been on the verge of despair now found a spark of hope. Every step, every sprint toward the helicopter was a defiance of the abandonment they had endured. The landing was brutal. Dust clouds enveloped the valley, blinding vision, choking lungs, and obscuring obstacles. Rachel kept her focus, guiding the helicopter onto uneven ground, skimming rocks, and avoiding craters. The rotors created a tornado of debris, and yet the Marines pressed forward. Some crawled, others ran on adrenaline alone, carrying the wounded toward the aircraft. The helicopter shuddered under the load, metal groaning, engines screaming, but Rachel held her nerve. She had trained for moments like this, but nothing could prepare her for the intensity of reality. Every second on the ground was a battle. Enemy fire rained around them, forcing the crew to return suppressive fire while Marines loaded aboard. Private First Class Daniel Ortega helped lift a wounded comrade, gritting his teeth as bullets zipped past. Sergeant Jackson coordinated fire, keeping enemy snipers pinned, while Rachel maintained the helicopter's precarious balance. Sweat, blood, and dust coated everyone, yet they moved with singular purpose. The impossible was happening. Marines abandoned for dead were being rescued. Rachel's adrenaline surged as she executed the extraction. Her focus was total. Every muscle, every thought, every reflex was committed to survival. She repeated the maneuver again and again, returning to the same dangerous landing zone under fire, each time pulling Marines to safety. With every trip, the helicopter's weight increased, engines groaned under stress, and the risk of disaster grew exponentially. Yet failure was not an option. She had chosen this path, broken every rule, and now it demanded perfection. Her crew worked in flawless unison. The co-pilot adjusted controls, monitoring altitude and engine strain. Gunners provided covering fire, suppressing enemy positions, while communication officers relayed instructions to the Marines below. Rachel glanced at each of them, acknowledging their courage with a subtle nod. They were not just supporting her, they were integral to the success of the mission. Without their skill and composure, the rescue would have been impossible. As the first wave of Marines lifted off, Rachel assessed the battlefield below. Shadows moved like predators, enemy forces repositioning, aware that their extraction was underway. Rachel's hands flew over the controls, performing evasive maneuvers with surgical precision. Her heart pounded, yet her mind remained clear. One slip could leave dozens of Marines exposed. She reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Back on the ground, Hayes and Simmons continued coordinating. They had trained their troops to function under extreme stress, but the reality of a real rescue was different from drills. Marines dragged the wounded, assisted each other over rocks, and sprinted across open terrain to reach the helicopter. Every Marine's movement mattered. Each success, each safe boarding, was a triumph against overwhelming odds. They had been abandoned, ignored, and written off, but now, through sheer courage and skill, they were fighting to reclaim their lives. The first round of extractions was completed, but Rachel knew the mission was far from over. The helicopter was near maximum capacity, engines straining under the weight of soldiers here and wounded. Every landing risked exposure to enemy fire. Yet she refused to leave anyone behind. One Marine left on the ground meant one life lost, a cost she was unwilling to pay. She adjusted the helicopter, signaling for the next wave of Marines to move into position. The rhythm of rescue had begun, terrifying yet exhilarating in its audacity. Minutes stretched like hours as the helicopter rose again, carrying those first rescued soldiers toward temporary safety. Rachel allowed herself a brief glance at the Marines aboard, faces covered in sweat, dirt, and grime, but eyes wide with disbelief and hope. This was why she had defied protocol. This was why she had risked everything. Their survival was proof that courage, skill, and determination could overcome bureaucracy, fear, and even death itself. Yet danger was not over. Enemy fire continued, engines screamed, and the terrain offered no mercy. Rachel's mind raced, recalculating trajectories, landing zones, and contingencies for emergencies. She was aware that one misstep could reverse every success, turning salvation into tragedy. Still, she pressed on. The impossible mission was unfolding, and she was at the center of it, guiding it with nerves of steel and an unyielding commitment to human life. Every landing, every extraction, every maneuver was a calculated defiance of every rule she had been taught to obey. She had broken protocol, yet for the first time in her life, Rachel felt the clarity that came from doing what was unquestionably right. There were no medals, no accolades, no safe bureaucratic approval, only the knowledge that 540 Marines had a fighting chance. And as the helicopter lifted once again, engines roaring, Rachel knew that rules could be rewritten by courage, and that one person could defy every expectation to save hundreds of lives. The helicopter's engines roared like a living beast, cutting through the night sky as Captain Rachel Donovan guided it over the jagged ridges. The valley below was a hellscape of smoke, dust, and flashes of gunfire. Every ridge, every crevice seemed alive with danger. Enemy snipers were everywhere, hidden in shadows, their rifles trained on the whirring rotors. Rachel gritted her teeth, eyes sharp as she scanned for threats, hands steady on the controls. One wrong move, one misjudgment of altitude or angle, and the helicopter could be shredded, leaving the Marines below to die. Below, the battalion's morale flickered between hope and disbelief. Echo Battalion had endured days of abandonment, starvation, and relentless attacks, yet they moved with renewed determination as the sound of the helicopter reached their ears. Private First Class Daniel Ortega shielded the wounded, while Corporal Lila Simmons barked orders, directing squads to safer positions for boarding. Every second mattered. Dust and debris whipped their faces, mingling with sweat, blood, and fear, but no one faltered. They had trained for adversity, but nothing had prepared them for the intensity of being rescued under fire. Rachel's co-pilot, Lieutenant Jackson, called out enemy positions as they tracked them on radar. "Sniper, left ridge, 300 meters. He shouted, voice tight with urgency. Rachel adjusted the helicopter's tilt, avoiding the line of fire while keeping the aircraft steady for extraction. Gunner Sergeant Miller returned suppressive fire from the mounted machine gun, the deafening roar of bullets echoing through the valley. The helicopter rocked violently as rounds impacted near the fuselage, metal groaning under the stress. Yet Rachel remained calm, calculating each maneuver with precision honed over years of combat training. The first landing was a perilous ballet of skill and nerve. Rachel guided the helicopter onto uneven ground, skimming rocks and craters, her focus absolute. Marines sprinted toward the aircraft, carrying the wounded, dragging the injured, and hoisting themselves aboard. Dust churned into a blinding whirlwind, yet every Marine reached the helicopter safely. Rachel's hands flew over the controls, maintaining balance under the growing weight of bodies and gear. Engines strained, metal groaned, and rotor blades sliced through the thick night air, yet she pressed on, unwavering. Every liftoff was a gamble. The valley was alive with enemy fire, tracers illuminating the darkness. Rachel's helicopter swayed dangerously under the combined weight of soldiers and supplies. One misstep could tip the craft, sending everyone plummeting into the rocky ravine below. Yet she refused to retreat. Every Marine aboard represented a life saved, a testament to courage and defiance against impossible odds. Her crew operated with precision, each member anticipating threats, coordinating actions, and providing critical support. Their unity was as essential as the aircraft itself. The second landing was even more harrowing. Enemy fire intensified as they recognized the extraction in progress. Rockets streaked across the sky, narrowly missing the helicopter, and sniper rounds struck perilously close. Rachel executed evasive maneuvers while keeping the helicopter steady for boarding. Marines below moved like shadows, sprinting, crawling, and leaping over debris to reach the aircraft. Private Ortega hoisted a severely wounded comrade onto the skids, muscles screaming in pain, refusing to leave him behind. Each successful boarding was a victory, yet the danger escalated with every moment. Inside the helicopter, the wounded groaned, fear etched into every face. Rachel's eyes swept the cabin, ensuring balance and stability while calculating fuel reserves and enemy positions. Each liftoff carried more weight, more risk. Her hands danced over the controls, adjusting altitude, pitch, and speed to keep the helicopter aloft. She could feel the strain in every bolt, every rotor blade, yet she maintained control, driven by a singular focus. Every Marine must live. The cacophony of engines, gunfire, and human movement created a chaotic symphony, yet it was orchestrated with precision and courage. The third and fourth trips pushed the limits of endurance. Fuel levels dropped dangerously low. Engines strained under the weight of soldiers and supplies, and enemy fire became relentless. Every moment on the ground was a test of nerve. Rachel moved with a calm intensity, issuing precise commands to her crew. Suppressive fire, evasive maneuvers, and careful landings became a rhythm, a dangerous dance against death. Marines below sprinted, dragged, and leapt, trusting Rachel's skill and the bravery of her crew. Each extraction was a testament to human resilience. Soldiers who had endured days without food or water now clung to hope as they boarded the helicopter. They shared brief, exhausted smiles, whispered words of gratitude, and glances of disbelief. For them, the impossible had become tangible. Survival was within reach. Every Marine aboard carried not just their own life, but the collective spirit of a battalion that had refused to surrender. Rachel's mind remained razor-sharp. Every movement, every turn, every landing had to be calculated. She monitored fuel levels, rotor stress, and terrain while anticipating enemy positions. One mistake could doom the mission. Yet she pressed on, driven by courage and an unwavering sense of duty. Each successful liftoff fueled determination, while every near miss reminded her of the stakes. The helicopter, her crew, and the Marines had become a single entity, operating in perfect synchronization against overwhelming odds. A fifth trip was the most dangerous. Enemy forces had begun targeting landing zones with greater accuracy, anticipating repeated extractions. Tracer rounds streaked through the night, igniting panic among those on the ground. Rachel executed evasive maneuvers with split-second precision, dodging rounds while keeping the helicopter steady. Her crew worked in seamless coordination, covering blind spots, providing suppressive fire, and communicating with soldiers below. Dust and smoke obscured vision, yet the rhythm of rescue persisted. Every Marine aboard represented a triumph against despair. As the helicopter rose again, carrying its latest passengers to safety, Rachel allowed herself a brief glance at the valley below. Shadows moved among rocks and craters, enemy forces reorganizing, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Yet the sight of the rescued Marines aboard, alive and breathing, steeled her resolve. One mission, one helicopter, one determined pilot could defy expectations, rewrite the narrative, and challenge the cold calculus of bureaucracy. Courage, skill, and human determination were the ultimate weapons. Rachel's crew, though exhausted, remained focused. Lieutenant Jackson monitored enemy positions. Sergeant Miller provided covering fire, and communication officers relayed instructions to Marines still on the ground. Every member understood that failure was unacceptable, that hesitation could cost lives. Yet the operation pressed forward, each extraction bringing more Marines closer to safety. The impossible rescue was becoming reality, a testament to human courage, resilience, and ingenuity. As the helicopter lifted off for another run, Rachel's hands tightened on the controls, eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow, every movement. The valley below had become a crucible of survival, and she was at its center, orchestrating the impossible. Dust, smoke, and tracer fire whipped around them, yet she maintained calm precision. Each landing, each liftoff, each Marine saved was a victory over despair, a defiance of rules, and a triumph of courage. The battalion below, once abandoned and written off, now watched their salvation take form. Hope, fragile but persistent, ignited in their hearts. The impossible was happening. A helicopter had arrived, piloted by a woman willing to break every rule, defy every order, and risk everything to save 540 lives. Every Marine sprinting toward the aircraft felt the pulse of possibility, the surge of determination, and the fire of survival. As Rachel maneuvered for yet another landing, she knew the mission was far from over. Enemy fire would grow more precise, fuel would continue to dwindle, and fatigue threatened to compromise judgment. Yet there was no room for hesitation. The rescue, though perilous, must continue. Every Marine saved was proof that courage, determination, and defiance of protocol could overcome even the most impossible odds. And as the helicopter descended once more, engines roaring against the night, Rachel Donovan prepared to defy death itself for the battalion, for her crew, and for the ideals that demanded action when all hope seemed lost. The valley below had become a theater of chaos. Smoke twisted into the sky like dark tendrils, dust churned by rotor wash, and the crack of enemy gunfire echoed against jagged cliffs. Captain Rachel Donovan's helicopter hovered precariously over uneven terrain, engines screaming under the weight of soldiers, wounded, and gear. Every moment on the ground was a gamble. Every second in the air was a contest between survival and destruction. Yet Rachel's focus was unwavering. Failure was not an option, not now, when the lives of 540 Marines hung in the balance. Brace for landing. Rachel called, voice calm but urgent. The first wave of Marines sprinted toward the aircraft, dragging the wounded, assisting the exhausted, and leaping over rocky craters. Corporal Lila Simmons barked instructions, her voice cutting through the roar of engines and gunfire. Move, move, move. Don't stop for anyone except the wounded. Soldiers obeyed, adrenaline surging through their veins, muscles burning with exhaustion. They had been abandoned, written off by command, yet now, guided by courage and determination, they fought to reclaim their lives. The landing was violent. Dust and debris whipped the valley into a blinding storm, rotor wash tearing through the already devastated terrain. Rachel adjusted controls continuously, compensating for uneven ground and the growing weight of passengers. Every Marine aboard increased the strain on the helicopter, pushing it to the edge of its capacity. Engines groaned under the load. Metal shuddered as if protesting the impossible task. Yet Rachel remained calm, calculating, precise. She had trained for emergencies, yet nothing could replicate the intensity of this extraction. Enemy fire intensified. Snipers and hidden positions had identified the helicopter's patterns and targeted landing zones with deadly precision. Tracer rounds streaked across the darkness, illuminating dust clouds, soldiers, and obstacles. Rachel executed evasive maneuvers with razor-sharp reflexes, keeping the aircraft steady for boarding. Sergeant Miller returned fire from the mounted guns, suppressing enemy snipers as Marines scrambled aboard. Each second was a delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. The impossible extraction had become a brutal test of skill, nerve, and courage. Marines below moved in a blur of determination. Private First Class Daniel Ortega hoisted a wounded comrade onto the skids, sweat and blood mixing with the dust in his hair. Others carried stretchers, assisted injured teammates, and sprinted toward the aircraft under fire. Corporal Simmons coordinated with precision, ensuring no one was left behind. The rhythm of extraction was harrowing: load, lift, move, repeat, but every Marine knew that success meant life. Failure meant death. Every heartbeat mattered. Rachel's mind raced. Fuel was dangerously low. The helicopter strained under the growing number of passengers. Enemy positions were tightening the trap, cutting off escape routes. Every landing zone became more perilous. Yet Rachel refused to retreat. Every Marine left behind would be a life lost, a betrayal of trust she could never forgive herself for. She adjusted the aircraft, communicating with her crew, orchestrating the next wave of boarding. The mission had become a delicate dance of survival against overwhelming odds. The next landing pushed the limits of human endurance in engineering. Rachel guided the helicopter onto a precarious patch of uneven terrain, rotor wash kicking up rocks and debris. Marines scrambled across the battlefield, some injured, some exhausted, all desperate. The co-pilot monitored altitude and fuel, calling out adjustments in precise tones. The gunner fired suppressive rounds, covering the extraction with deadly accuracy. Sweat stung Rachel's eyes, yet she never wavered. Every hand, every step, every breath was focused on one singular objective: saving every Marine. As the helicopter lifted off once more, Rachel glanced at the soldiers aboard. Faces covered in grime, sweat, and blood, yet eyes wide with disbelief and hope. Some whispered words of gratitude, others simply clutched at each other, overwhelmed by the reality of survival. The impossible extraction was not just about the mechanics of flight. It was about human resilience, trust, and the indomitable will to live. Every life aboard represented triumph over despair, courage over abandonment, and determination over bureaucracy. Yet the mission was far from over. The helicopter was near maximum capacity, engines straining under the load. Enemy fire intensified as they anticipated repeated landings. Rockets streaked across the night sky, narrowly missing the aircraft. Sniper fire zipped dangerously close to rotor blades, forcing Rachel into hair-raising evasive maneuvers. Dust, smoke, and tracer fire created a blinding whirlwind. Every second was a gamble, every movement a high-stakes calculation. One misstep, one misjudgment, and the entire mission could collapse. Rachel's crew remained steady, their trust in her absolute. Lieutenant Jackson monitored radar and enemy positions, relaying crucial information. Sergeant Miller provided covering fire with lethal precision, while communication officers coordinated with Marines still on the ground. Every action was a synchronized effort, a choreography of survival and courage under fire. They were not just supporting Rachel, they were a part of the lifeline keeping hundreds of soldiers alive. The impossible extraction was a testament to teamwork, skill, and determination. The final waves of extraction were the most perilous. Exhaustion gnawed at muscles, nerves and minds alike. Yet the Marines moved with determination, understanding that their survival depended on every second. Corporal Simmons barked orders, rallying soldiers to push past pain, fatigue, and fear. Private Ortega hoisted the last wounded comrade aboard, trembling but resolute. Rachel's hands flew over the controls, maintaining stability while simultaneously monitoring fuel, rotor stress, and enemy positions. She refused to leave anyone behind. Every life mattered. Enemy fire intensified as the last Marines boarded. The helicopter shuddered under the strain, rotor blades slicing through air thick with dust, smoke, and tracer rounds. Rachel executed evasive maneuvers with precision, maintaining balance, altitude, and speed. Every heartbeat was a test of endurance. The final extraction was a culmination of courage, skill, and human determination. Success meant survival. Failure meant tragedy. Rachel's eyes burned with focus, every muscle coiled with tension, every thought dedicated to one goal, bringing everyone home alive. As the helicopter lifted off with the last Marines aboard, Rachel allowed herself a brief moment to survey the battlefield below. The valley, once a hellscape of chaos, now seemed quieter, though danger still lingered in shadows. Hundreds of Marines, previously abandoned and written off, were now airborne, alive, and moving toward temporary safety. The impossible extraction had been achieved, but the cost, the intensity, and the courage required would not soon be forgotten. For Rachel Donovan, the mission was far from over. She had defied protocol, risked her career, and placed herself in mortal danger. Yet in that moment, she felt clarity, purpose, and resolve. The helicopter, battered but intact, carried the weight of 540 lives. Each Marine aboard was proof that courage, defiance, and skill could overcome despair, bureaucracy, and impossible odds. The impossible extraction was complete not by procedure, not by protocol, but by heroism in its purest form. The valley below, now partially cleared of Marines, bore silent witness to the extraordinary feat. Dust settled, tracer rounds ceased, and the night air hummed with relief and disbelief. Lives had been saved through courage, teamwork, and sheer determination. Captain Rachel Donovan's defiance of rules, her refusal to abandon her fellow Americans, and the precision of her crew had rewritten the fate of 540 Marines. History would remember this as a mission that could have failed at every turn, and yet succeeded against impossible odds. As the helicopter carried the Marines toward safety, Rachel's mind remained alert. Danger was never far, fuel was still limited, and exhaustion threatened to compromise judgment. Yet she pressed on, understanding that her responsibility did not end until every Marine was delivered to a safe zone. She adjusted controls, monitored the crew, and guided the aircraft with unwavering precision. Every movement was calculated, every decision deliberate, every breath committed to survival. For the soldiers aboard, survival had transformed into hope. They had endured days of abandonment, extreme danger, and relentless fire, yet now they were alive. The impossible extraction had saved them not by luck, but by the courage and skill of one woman willing to break every rule to protect them. They were no longer statistics. They were living proof that heroism, defiance, and human determination could defy fate itself. The valley had grown eerily quiet, but danger was far from over. Captain Rachel Donovan hovered the helicopter above a jagged ridge, eyes scanning the terrain below. The wind tore through the rotors, dust and smoke stinging her eyes, while tracer rounds from hidden snipers painted streaks of light across the dark landscape. Each round was a reminder that the enemy had adapted, learned from previous waves, and would stop at nothing to prevent the escape of the remaining Marines. The last load was the most dangerous yet the final extraction that would decide whether any of the battalion would be left behind. Inside the helicopter, the crew worked like a well-oiled machine. Lieutenant Jackson monitored enemy positions, relaying updates with clipped urgency. Sergeant Miller's mounted machine guns roared to life, laying down suppressive fire to cover the landing zone. Communication officers coordinated with Marines still on the ground, ensuring everyone knew where to run, when to move, and how to board. Every second was critical. The air crackled with tension, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and grim determination. Failure was not an option. Corporal Lila Simmons sprinted across the valley, rallying the remaining Marines. Faces streaked with blood and dust reflected exhaustion, yet their eyes burned with unbroken resolve. The wounded were hoisted on stretchers. The able-bodied ran with backpacks loaded with gear, and every soldier moved with the knowledge that this was their last chance. Behind her, the enemy had set up a deadly crossfire, anticipating the helicopter's approach. Yet Simmons refused to falter. "Keep moving. Everyone on board now," she shouted, voice cutting through the roar of engines and gunfire. Rachel's hands gripped the controls, muscles taut, heart hammering. She adjusted the helicopter, tilting to avoid jagged rocks while keeping the skids low enough for Marines to board. The aircraft shuddered under the combined weight of soldiers and gear. Dust, smoke, and debris formed a blinding vortex around them. Every instinct screamed danger, yet Rachel's focus was absolute. This was the culmination of every risk, every sacrifice, every daring move she had made since deciding to defy orders. The last load would test everything. Enemy fire intensified as the helicopter descended. Rockets streaked past, narrowly missing the aircraft, while sniper rounds pinged off the fuselage. Rachel executed evasive maneuvers with split-second precision, weaving between ridges and valleys, compensating for rotor wash and the helicopter's increasingly heavy load. Sergeant Miller provided relentless suppressive fire, each burst protecting the Marines scrambling to board. Every second was a battle between life and death. The last load was also the most harrowing, the final test of courage under fire. Private First Class Daniel Ortega carried the last of the wounded, his arms trembling under the strain. Marines pushed through fear, exhaustion, and pain, sprinting toward the helicopter like shadows on fire. Dust choked their lungs, sweat mingled with blood, yet every step was a defiance of despair. Corporal Simmons coordinated movements, barking precise instructions, ensuring no one was left behind. "Everyone move. Now, move." Her voice was iron, steady, resolute. Hope, fragile but unyielding, surged among the remaining soldiers. Rachel's co-pilot called out, "Landing zone clear, just barely." "They're moving fast." Rachel adjusted the aircraft, skids touching down on even, rocky ground. The helicopter rocked violently, metal groaning under the strain, yet she maintained control. Marines sprinted toward the aircraft, dragging stretchers, lifting the wounded, and climbing aboard. The rotor wash turned the valley into a chaotic storm, yet every Marine reached the helicopter. The last load was underway the moment where courage, skill, and determination would collide with danger in its purest form. Inside the helicopter, the wounded groaned, fear etched on their faces. Yet hope flickered in every eye. Rachel scanned the cabin, ensuring balance while maintaining control. Every movement, every adjustment of the controls was a delicate calculation. Engines strained, rotor blades screamed, yet the helicopter remained aloft. The last Marines were aboard. One more second of failure could undo everything, but Rachel's skill, nerve, and determination held them steady. She had broken every rule, defied every order, and now she faced the ultimate test of heroism. Enemy fire intensified for a final assault. Snipers took precise aim, anticipating the helicopter's path, while hidden positions launched rockets with deadly accuracy. Rachel executed evasive maneuvers, tilting the aircraft, dodging rounds, and keeping the last Marines safe. Sergeant Miller returned fire with lethal precision, covering the boarding zone. Lieutenant Jackson provided real-time updates on enemy positions, ensuring Rachel could navigate the treacherous terrain. Every second was a fight, every movement a battle against overwhelming odds. The helicopter lifted off with a violent shudder, dust and debris swirling like a storm. Marines clung to the aircraft, faces streaked with sweat, dirt, and tears, yet eyes wide with disbelief and hope. The impossible had been achieved. The last load, the final extraction, was in motion. Rachel maintained a steady course, guiding the helicopter through jagged cliffs, enemy fire, and treacherous terrain. Every decision was critical, every maneuver precise. The mission, which had begun with abandonment and despair, was reaching its climactic moment. Corporal Simmons finally allowed herself a glance at the valley below. It was a landscape of chaos, destruction, and exhaustion, yet it had yielded to determination and courage. Hundreds of Marines, once abandoned and deemed expendable, were now airborne, alive, and moving toward safety. Her heart swelled with pride and relief. The battalion had endured the impossible and survived through skill, trust, and unwavering resolve. Each Marine aboard the helicopter was proof of the extraordinary human spirit. Rachel's focus remained sharp. Fuel was low, engines were strained, and enemy fire could still strike. Yet she pressed on, guiding the helicopter toward temporary safety. Every Marine aboard represented triumph over despair, courage over bureaucracy, and skill over overwhelming odds. Each life saved was a testament to human determination, teamwork, and heroism in its purest form. Rachel had defied protocol, risked everything, and now, in this climactic moment, she was delivering the final, miraculous rescue. The valley receded beneath them, lights from distant enemy positions fading as the helicopter ascended. The battalion, once abandoned, had been saved. Soldiers who had endured starvation, injury, and relentless attacks now clung to hope, gratitude, and disbelief. Rachel glanced at her crew, exhausted, tense, yet resolute. Each member had contributed to this triumph. The impossible extraction had been executed flawlessly, a feat of courage, skill, and human determination that would never be forgotten. As the helicopter soared toward safety, Rachel allowed herself a brief exhale. The mission was far from over. The journey to a secure zone remained dangerous, and every second required vigilance. Yet the final load had been completed. Every Marine, every soldier, every wounded comrade had been saved from certain death. The impossible extraction, the defiance of bureaucracy, the triumph over despair had all come to fruition. Courage, determination, and skill had rewritten the fate of 540 Marines. The valley below, once a theater of chaos, now bore witness to extraordinary heroism. Dust settled, smoke dispersed, and silence fell, marking the end of the most harrowing chapter in the battalion's history. Captain Rachel Donovan, by defying orders and risking everything, had proven that one person's courage could overcome bureaucracy, danger, and despair. Every Marine aboard the helicopter now owed their life to her skill, nerve, and unwavering resolve. The last load had succeeded, and with it, hope had triumphed over abandonment. The first rays of dawn broke over the rugged terrain as Captain Rachel Donovan guided the helicopter toward the forward operating base. Exhausted Marines clung to the skids and seats, their faces smeared with dust, blood, and sweat, but lit with relief and disbelief. The impossible had been achieved. 540 Marines, once abandoned and written off, had been rescued. Silence reigned in the valley below, punctuated only by the distant echo of engines fading into the morning sky. For the soldiers aboard, the nightmare of combat, abandonment, and despair was over for now. Inside the helicopter, the atmosphere was electric, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet jubilation. Corporal Lila Simmons slumped back in her seat, wiping blood and sweat from her brow. "We made it," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Private Ortega, still trembling from adrenaline and fear, nodded, staring at the cabin ceiling as if it had suddenly become sacred. The weight of what had happened, the lives saved, the risks taken, the defiance of protocol, was only beginning to sink in. Rachel allowed herself a brief exhale, her hands relaxing slightly on the controls. Every nerve in her body still hummed with tension. Every muscle coiled from hours of strain, but there was a warmth spreading through her chest. She had risked everything: her career, her life, her reputation. Yet in that moment, as the base grew closer and the dust of the battlefield faded behind them, she understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished. This was heroism in its purest, most uncompromising form. As the helicopter descended toward the base, soldiers stationed on the tarmac scrambled to assist, forming a human chain to help the Marines disembark. Wounded were carefully lifted onto stretchers, the able-bodied guided to safe zones, and every individual received water, medical attention, and reassurance. The air buzzed with a mix of shouting, laughter, tears, and applause. For the first time in days, the battalion could breathe, unburdened by the terror of abandonment. Every life saved was a testament to courage and determination. Rachel's crew moved with practiced precision, assisting Marines as they disembarked. Lieutenant Jackson offered quiet words of encouragement. Sergeant Miller checked equipment, and communication officers relayed final status reports to command. The helicopter, now lighter and more manageable, sat idle on the tarmac, exhausted yet victorious. It had borne the weight of hundreds of lives through danger, fire, and impossible odds. Each dent, scratch, and burn told a story of survival, defiance, and heroism. On the tarmac, Captain Rachel Donovan was met with stunned silence and uproarious applause. Soldiers she had saved came forward, some collapsing to hug her, others simply staring with wide-eyed disbelief. "You saved us," whispered one Marine, voice shaking. "I thought we were done for." Tears ran down faces hardened by battle, proof of raw emotion finally released. Rachel's eyes brimmed, but she remained composed. She had done her duty, but she also understood the depth of human connection in moments of extreme crisis. Commanders arrived, some in disbelief, some shaking with admiration. Protocols had been broken, rules bent, orders defied, but the results were undeniable. 540 lives had been saved. Rachel listened to the murmurs of praise, the recounting of every near miss, every daring maneuver. She allowed herself a small, tired smile. Rules, procedure, and red tape mattered little in the face of raw courage, determination, and human empathy. In that moment, she knew that the lives saved were more important than any medal or reprimand. The wounded received medical care, some stabilized, others prepared for transport to larger facilities. Marines shared stories of their ordeal, recounting harrowing escapes, near misses, and moments of despair that had been shattered by the sudden, miraculous arrival of the helicopter. Rachel listened quietly, humbled by the resilience of her fellow Americans. She had only guided the aircraft, but it was the soldiers' courage, trust, and determination that had made the rescue possible. Heroism, she realized, was never solitary. It was a collective force. As the sun climbed higher, Rachel finally stepped away from the helicopter, legs trembling from exhaustion. She felt the weight of adrenaline lifting, replaced by a profound sense of fulfillment. The impossible mission, the defiance of protocol, the risks taken against overwhelming odds, all had culminated in survival, hope, and the reaffirmation of human resilience. The valley, once a crucible of danger, chaos, and despair, now stood as a testament to courage. Every life aboard the helicopter was proof that heroism, determination, and skill could defy even the most impossible circumstances. Command held a brief debriefing. There would be reports, accolades, perhaps reprimands, and certainly questions about the mission's legality and defiance of orders. Yet Rachel remained calm. She understood the stakes, the risks, and the consequences, but she also knew the truth. Rules mattered less than lives. 540 Marines had returned from the brink of death. Bureaucracy could wait. Humanity could not. In the quiet moments between chaos and celebration, Rachel felt a deep connection to every soldier she had saved, every risk she had taken, and every moment that had brought them to safety. Soldiers began to relax, sharing laughter and tears, recounting harrowing moments of the rescue. Bonds were forged and strengthened in ways that only life or death experiences could create. Marines embraced each other, soldiers who had been strangers hours before, now united by shared survival. Rachel observed silently, heart full, understanding that this was the true reward of the mission. The impossible had been made real not by procedure or protocol, but by courage, teamwork, and sheer human determination. As Rachel looked back toward the valley, she saw the rising sun illuminating the rugged peaks, casting long shadows over the battlefield below. Dust and smoke still lingered, remnants of chaos, yet the morning air was tinged with hope. The battalion was safe, lives were intact, and a story of heroism had been etched into history. Captain Rachel Donovan had risked everything, defied every order, and through skill, courage, and resolve, had turned despair into triumph. The helicopter, now empty of passengers, sat quietly on the tarmac, a silent witness to the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Its metal frame bore the scars of near destruction, yet it had carried hope, life, and salvation through fire, smoke, and chaos. Rachel ran her hand along the controls, acknowledging the machine that had been an extension of her courage. Every dent, every scratch, every burn was a story of survival, defiance, and heroism. As the last Marines were stabilized and taken to medical care, Rachel finally allowed herself to breathe fully. Exhaustion, relief, and pride washed over her. She had defied protocol, risked her life, and saved 540 Americans from certain death. The impossible mission, the abandoned battalion, the harrowing valley, all had been conquered not by bureaucracy, but by courage, skill, and the unbreakable human spirit. History would remember the rescue, but more importantly, the lives saved would tell the story forever.